In the winter of 1978, in the industrial wasteland of Rostov-on-Don, Russia, a woman's scream pierced the frozen air. Then silence. By morning, her mutilated body was found in a snow-covered field, carved open like a grotesque anatomy lesson. The killer had taken his time. He'd removed her eyes, sliced away strips of flesh, and arranged her organs in a pattern that made seasoned detectives vomit. The police assumed it was an isolated incident, a crime of passion, perhaps, a domestic dispute gone wrong. They had no idea they were staring at the first signature of Andre Chicatillo, a man who would become the Soviet Union's most prolific serial killer, a man whose hunger for human flesh would consume 56 lives over the next 12 years. But here's what makes Chicatillo truly terrifying. He wasn't some wild-eyed maniac lurking in shadows. He was a teacher, a father, a Communist Party member who wore pressed suits and spoke softly about literature and history. During the day, he educated children about morality and civic duty. At night, he hunted them. Andrei Romanovich Chicatillo was born in 1936 in Ukraine during one of the darkest chapters in Soviet history. Stalin's forced collectivization had triggered a famine so severe that people resorted to cannibalism to survive. Chicatillo's older brother, Stepan, disappeared during this time. The family whispered that he'd been kidnapped and eaten by desperate neighbors. Whether true or not, this story haunted young Andre. It planted seeds in his mind that would later bloom into something monstrous. As a child, Chicatillo was weak, sickly, and nearly blind without glasses. He wet the bed until he was 12, earning brutal beatings from his mother. She would scream at him, calling him worthless, broken, a mistake. His father was absent, fighting in World War II, leaving Andre alone with a woman whose love felt like punishment. School offered no refuge. Classmates mocked his thick glasses and stammering speech. He was the boy everyone ignored, the one who ate lunch alone and walked home in silence. But inside that quiet exterior, something was building: rage, shame, and a growing fascination with violence that he couldn't understand or control. By his teenage years, Chicatillo had discovered something disturbing about himself. He couldn't achieve sexual arousal through normal means. The only thing that excited him was violence, pain, the sight of blood. He began fantasizing about hurting people, about cutting them open and watching the life drain from their eyes. These weren't fleeting thoughts. They consumed him, playing in his mind like a film reel he couldn't turn off. Despite his inner turmoil, Chicatillo managed to build what appeared to be a normal life. He became a teacher, married a woman named Feodosia, and had 2 children. To his neighbors, he seemed like a model Soviet citizen, quiet, hardworking, devoted to his family. But the mask was slipping. In 1973, while working as a teacher in a rural school, Chicatillo committed his first known murder. He lured a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova to an abandoned shack, promising to show her something interesting. Inside that rotting building, he attempted to rape her. When she struggled, when she screamed, something snapped. He stabbed her repeatedly, watching her small body convulse with each thrust of the blade. And for the first time in his life, he felt complete. He threw her body into a nearby river and walked home as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he taught his classes with the same quiet demeanor. He helped his wife with household chores. He read bedtime stories to his children. The only sign of what he'd done was a small bloodstain on his shirt cuff, which he explained away as a nosebleed. The murder went unsolved for months. When police finally arrested a suspect, it wasn't Chicatillo. It was a local man with a criminal record who happened to be in the area. Under brutal interrogation, the man confessed to a crime he didn't commit. He was executed by firing squad, while the real killer continued teaching children about right and wrong. For the next 5 years, Chicatillo managed to suppress his urges. He threw himself into his work, took on extra responsibilities, even joined the Communist Party. But the hunger never left. It grew stronger, more insistent, like a parasite feeding on his sanity. Then came 1978 and the woman in the snow-covered field. This time, Chicatillo didn't just kill, he mutilated. He bit chunks of flesh from her body and chewed them slowly, savoring the taste of copper and salt. He removed her uterus and carried it with him for days, a grotesque trophy that he would fondle in private moments. The killing had awakened something primal in him. Within months, he struck again. A teenage boy this time, lured to a secluded forest with promises of work. Chicatillo strangled him with his bare hands, then used a knife to carve away pieces of flesh. He ate some of it raw, right there in the dirt, blood running down his chin like a wild animal. The pattern was set. Every few months, sometimes more frequently, Chicatillo would hunt. He targeted the vulnerable, runaway children, prostitutes, vagrants, anyone society wouldn't immediately miss. He would approach them with his teacher's voice, calm and reassuring, offering help or opportunity. Once they were isolated, the mask would fall away, revealing the monster beneath. His method was always the same. He would overpower his victims, then begin the ritual. First, he would remove their eyes, believing it would prevent them from identifying him in the afterlife. Then came the systematic mutilation. He would slice away strips of skin, remove organs, bite off fingers and toes. The sexual organs were always destroyed, carved away with surgical precision, and throughout it all, he would achieve the arousal that normal intimacy could never provide. Between murders, Chicatillo lived his double life with chilling normalcy. He was promoted to supply clerk for a factory, a position that required extensive travel throughout the Soviet Union. This gave him access to train stations and bus stops, hunting grounds filled with transient victims. He would pack his briefcase with official documents and a hunting knife, the tools of both his trades. His family noticed nothing. His wife would later claim that he was a gentle husband, perhaps a bit distant, but never violent. His children saw him as a quiet father who helped with homework and attended school functions. Even his co-workers described him as reliable, if unremarkable. The only unusual thing about Andre Chicatillo was how utterly usual he seemed. But the bodies kept appearing across the Rostov region, then spreading to other provinces as Chicatillo's work took him farther from home. Each crime scene was more horrific than the last. Police found victims with their stomachs sliced open, intestines arranged in ritualistic patterns, children with their faces carved away, leaving only grinning skulls, women with their breasts removed and placed beside their heads like grotesque pillows. The Soviet authorities were baffled. This level of systematic brutality was supposed to be impossible in their perfect socialist society. Serial killing was a Western phenomenon, a product of capitalist decadence, so they blamed the crimes on mentally ill individuals, foreign agents, anyone except the truth that one of their model citizens was a cannibal. The investigation was hampered by bureaucracy and denial. Different regions refused to share information. Evidence was lost or ignored. Suspects were arrested based on political convenience rather than actual guilt. At least 3 innocent men were executed for Chicatillo's crimes while he continued his rampage undetected. By the mid-1980s, the body count had reached the dozens. Chicatillo had refined his technique, becoming more efficient, more careful. He learned to avoid leaving fingerprints, to dispose of evidence, to select victims who wouldn't be missed quickly. He was no longer the fumbling amateur who had killed Lena Zakotnova. He had become a professional predator. The breakthrough came in 1990 when a massive task force was finally assembled to coordinate the investigation. They analyzed the crime scenes, mapped the locations, studied the timing. A pattern emerged. Many of the murders occurred near train stations and bus stops along routes serviced by the factory where Chicatillo worked. On November 6, 1990, Chicatillo was observed approaching children at a train station. When police searched him, they found a knife and rope in his briefcase. His behavior was suspicious, but not enough for an arrest. They released him, but kept him under surveillance. 6 days later, he killed again. 8-year-old Sveta Korostik was found in the woods near the station, her body bearing Chicatillo's signature mutilations. This time, investigators were ready. They had narrowed their suspect list to a handful of men, and Chicatillo was at the top. When they arrested him on November 20th, 1990, he seemed almost relieved. The mask he had worn for decades was finally slipping away. Under interrogation, he began to confess, not just to recent murders, but to crimes stretching back over 12 years. The details he provided were so specific, so horrifically accurate, that investigators knew they had found their monster. Chicatillo confessed to 56 murders, though he claimed the actual number was higher. He described each killing with clinical precision, explaining his methods, his motivations, his feelings during the acts. He showed no remorse, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with families and dreams. To him, they had been nothing more than objects for his gratification. The trial began in 1992, conducted in a specially constructed cage to protect Chicatillo from the families of his victims. He sat behind bulletproof glass, occasionally shouting bizarre statements about being a mistake of nature, about being controlled by forces beyond his understanding. But mostly, he was quiet, almost serene, as if finally being exposed had brought him peace. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysis linked him to crime scenes across multiple provinces. Survivors identified him as the man who had approached their missing children. His own confessions provided details that only the killer could have known. On October 15th, 1992, Andre Chicatillo was sentenced to death. As the verdict was read, families of his victims wept with relief. Some shouted curses at the man who had destroyed their lives. Chicatillo himself showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a fact he had always known. He was executed by a single gunshot to the head on February 14th, 1994, Valentine's Day. His body was cremated immediately, the ashes scattered to prevent any shrine or memorial. The Soviet Union wanted to erase him completely, to pretend that such monsters couldn't exist in their perfect society. But erasure is impossible. The families remember. The investigators who worked the case still wake up screaming. And somewhere in the files of the Russian police, photographs and evidence remain, testament to what one quiet teacher accomplished in 12 years of hunting. Andre Chicatillo proved that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't wear a mask or hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie, grades homework, and kisses its children goodnight. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like everyone else. In the sterile corridors of Hadamar Psychiatric Hospital in Nazi Germany, patients whispered about the nurse who came in the night. They called her the Angel, not because she brought comfort, but because she brought the final sleep. Her footsteps were silent on the polished floors. Her smile was warm and reassuring, and her hands, those gentle hands that had once healed, had learned to kill with terrifying efficiency. Her name was Pauline Conicler, and she murdered over 210 patients in her care. But unlike the monsters we know from history books, Pauline wasn't driven by ideology or hatred. She killed because she enjoyed it, because watching life drain from helpless eyes gave her a satisfaction that nothing else could match. The year was 1941, and Germany's euthanasia program was in full swing. Thousands of mentally ill and disabled patients were being systematically murdered in hospitals across the Reich. It was called Action T4, a clinical name for industrial-scale killing. But while most of the deaths were carried out with gas chambers and lethal injections administered by doctors, Pauline had developed her own methods, personal methods. She had been working at Hadamar for 3 years when the program began. Before that, she was considered an exemplary nurse. Patients loved her gentle touch and soothing voice. Families praised her dedication. Supervisors noted her exceptional bedside manner in their reports. She was everything a caregiver should be: compassionate, attentive, and utterly trustworthy. But something had been growing inside Pauline, something dark and patient. She had always felt different from other people, disconnected from their emotions and concerns. When colleagues cried over difficult cases, she felt nothing. When patients suffered, she watched with clinical detachment. She learned to mimic appropriate responses, to nod sympathetically and make comforting sounds. But inside, she remained cold and curious. The first time she killed, it was almost accidental. An elderly patient was struggling to breathe, gasping and wheezing through the night. Pauline was supposed to administer medication to ease his suffering. Instead, she held a pillow over his face and pressed down gently. She told herself she was ending his pain, performing an act of mercy. But as she watched his eyes widen in terror, as she felt his body convulse beneath her hands, she experienced something she had never felt before: pure, electric pleasure. The death was attributed to natural causes. No one questioned the gentle nurse who had been caring for the patient. No one suspected that she had spent the final moments of his life studying his face, memorizing every detail of his transition from life to death. When the official euthanasia program began, Pauline volunteered immediately. She told her supervisors she wanted to help ease the suffering of the incurably ill. They were impressed by her compassion, her willingness to take on such difficult work. They had no idea they were giving a predator unlimited access to helpless prey. The program provided perfect cover for her activities. Patients were dying every day through official channels, their deaths documented and filed away without question. But Pauline wasn't satisfied with the impersonal efficiency of gas chambers and lethal injections. She wanted intimacy. She wanted to be present for every moment of the dying process. She began selecting her own victims from among the patients scheduled for termination. Instead of sending them to the gas chamber, she would volunteer to handle their cases personally. Her supervisors were grateful for her dedication. They never questioned why she preferred to work alone, why she insisted on night shifts, why she spent so much time with patients who were going to die anyway. Her methods were varied and creative. Sometimes she would inject air into their bloodstream, causing fatal embolisms. Other times, she would administer overdoses of medication, watching as they slipped into comas and died slowly over hours or days. She became expert at making deaths appear natural, timing her interventions to coincide with expected medical crises. But her favorite method was strangulation. She would wait until the ward was quiet, then slip into a patient's room with a length of medical tubing or a pillowcase. She would sit beside their bed, speaking in soothing tones about peace and rest, while slowly tightening the ligature around their throat. She learned to apply just enough pressure to maintain consciousness, to prolong the dying process, to savor every moment of their terror and confusion. The patients who survived her attention spoke of nightmares, of that angel who came in darkness, but their words were dismissed as delusions, symptoms of their mental illness. Who would believe the ravings of psychiatric patients over the testimony of a respected nurse? Pauline kept detailed records of her kills, hidden in her personal quarters. She wrote about each victim's final moments, their expressions, their last words. She sketched their faces as they died, capturing the exact moment when life left their eyes. These journals became her most treasured possessions, more precious than any photograph or memento. She began to experiment with different approaches, treating each murder as a learning experience. She would try new methods of restraint, different ways of applying pressure, various techniques for prolonging consciousness. She discovered that fear enhanced the experience, so she would sometimes reveal her intentions to victims before killing them, watching their faces transform from trust to terror. One patient, a young woman named Maria, had been scheduled for termination but was temporarily reprieved due to paperwork delays. Pauline couldn't wait. She entered Maria's room one night with a syringe filled with potassium chloride, a substance that would cause immediate cardiac arrest. But instead of administering it quickly, she sat beside the bed and explained exactly what was going to happen. "You're going to feel a burning sensation," she whispered, her voice still gentle and nurturing. "Your heart will start racing, then it will stop. It will hurt, but only for a moment. Then you'll be at peace." Maria tried to scream, but Pauline had already injected her with a paralytic agent. She could only lie there, conscious and aware, as the nurse slowly pushed the lethal injection into her IV line. Pauline watched her face throughout the process, taking notes on the progression of symptoms, the timeline of death. As the war progressed and the euthanasia program expanded, Pauline's opportunities multiplied. Trainloads of patients arrived daily, most destined for immediate termination. She volunteered to process new arrivals, ostensibly to help with the overwhelming workload. In reality, she was selecting the most interesting cases for her personal attention. She developed preferences. Young patients provided more dramatic reactions. Elderly ones died more peacefully, which she found less satisfying. Children were the most rewarding, their innocence and trust making the betrayal more complete. She would spend hours with child patients, gaining their affection, becoming their favorite nurse, before finally revealing her true nature in their final moments. The other staff members noticed her dedication but never questioned it. In the chaos of wartime medicine, with hundreds of patients dying weekly, individual deaths attracted little attention. Pauline's victims were lost in the statistical noise of the program, their murders hidden among the official killings. She began taking trophies: a lock of hair from a particularly memorable victim, a piece of jewelry from a patient who had trusted her completely, small items that she could hold and examine while reliving their deaths. She kept these mementos in a special box, arranged like a shrine to her accomplishments. By 1943, Pauline had killed over 200 patients. She had become the most prolific murderer in the hospital's history, though no one knew it. Her official record showed only dedication and compassion. Her personal record, hidden in her journals, told a different story entirely. The end came not through investigation or suspicion, but through simple bad luck. A new doctor, recently transferred from the Eastern Front, noticed irregularities in patient deaths on Pauline's shifts. He began asking questions, reviewing records, comparing mortality rates. What he found disturbed him enough to contact higher authorities. When they searched Pauline's quarters, they discovered her journals, her sketches, her collection of trophies. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Page after page of detailed descriptions of murders, clinical observations of dying patients, sketches of faces frozen in final agony. Pauline showed no remorse when confronted with the evidence. She seemed almost proud of her work, eager to discuss her methods and motivations. She explained that she had been providing a service, that her victims had been suffering, and she had ended their pain. But her journals revealed the truth. She had killed for pleasure, for the satisfaction of holding absolute power over helpless human beings. Her trial was conducted in secret, the authorities unwilling to publicize the extent of her crimes. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but the sentence was never carried out. As Allied forces approached Germany in 1945, Pauline was transferred to a secure facility where she died under mysterious circumstances. Some records suggest suicide. Others indicate she was killed by guards who had learned of her crimes. Her journals were destroyed, her trophies burned, her name erased from official records. The Nazi regime wanted no evidence of individual sadism within their systematic killing program. They preferred to maintain the fiction that the euthanasia program was a medical necessity, not an opportunity for personal gratification. But the patients remembered. Those who survived Hadamar spoke of the angel of death, the nurse who killed with gentle hands and a caring smile. Their testimonies, dismissed during the war as delusions, were finally taken seriously during post-war investigations. Slowly, the truth about Pauline Conicler emerged from the shadows of history. She had used her position of trust to commit some of the most intimate murders in recorded history. She had perverted the healing profession, turning medicine into a tool for personal satisfaction. She had proven that evil could wear a nurse's uniform and speak in soothing tones while committing unspeakable acts. Today, Hadamar is a memorial to the victims of Nazi euthanasia. Visitors walk through the same corridors where Pauline once hunted, past the rooms where she committed her crimes. But few know her name or her story. She remains one of history's forgotten monsters, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those we trust most completely. In the end, Pauline Conicler killed more people than many famous serial killers, but she did it with a smile and a gentle touch. She proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it whispers softly and holds your hand while it destroys you. In the summer of 1962, construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping center in suburban Chicago made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Buried beneath what had once been a quiet residential neighborhood, they found bones, hundreds of them, femurs and rib cages arranged in neat rows like a grotesque library, skulls stacked in pyramids, their empty sockets staring up at the Illinois sky. And at the center of it all, a handwritten sign that read, "My collection, property of H.H. Mudgett." The name meant nothing to the workers, nothing to the police who arrived at the scene, but it should have, because Herman Webster Mudgett had been collecting bones for over 30 years, and what they had found was only a fraction of his work. Mudgett wasn't his real name, of course. He had been born Howard Henry Holmes in 1861 in a small New Hampshire town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But Howard had learned early that names were just costumes, identities were tools, and the truth was whatever you could make people believe. As a child, Howard was fascinated by death in ways that disturbed even his own family. While other boys played with toy soldiers or marbles, Howard dissected dead animals he found in the woods. He would spend hours studying their anatomy, learning how bones connected, how organs functioned, how life became death. His parents thought it was a phase. His teachers assumed he would become a doctor. They had no idea they were watching a monster learn his trade. By the time he reached medical school at the University of Michigan, Howard had already committed his first murder. A classmate who had discovered Howard stealing cadavers from the anatomy lab. The boy threatened to report him, so Howard killed him with a scalpel to the throat, then dissected the body and sold the parts to medical supply companies. The death was ruled an accident, a tragic mishap in the laboratory. Howard graduated with honors. After medical school, he moved to Chicago and assumed the identity of Dr. H. Holmes. The city was booming, growing so fast that no one questioned credentials or checked backgrounds. He opened a pharmacy on the ground floor of a 3-story building he purchased and began construction on what would become known as his murder castle. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary commercial building, but Holmes had designed every room, every hallway, every closet with murder in mind. The second floor contained dozens of rooms connected by a maze of corridors that led nowhere. Some doors opened onto brick walls, others revealed staircases that descended into darkness. The basement was a charnel house of surgical tables, acid baths, and furnaces designed to dispose of human remains. Holmes hired workers to build his castle, but he never used the same crew twice. Each team completed only a small section before being dismissed and replaced. No one understood the building's true purpose except Holmes himself. And when workers asked too many questions or demanded overdue wages, they became part of the collection. The pharmacy was a front, a way to attract victims and establish credibility in the community. Holmes was charming, well-dressed, articulate. He spoke with the authority of education and the warmth of genuine concern. Women trusted him, men respected him, children followed him like a kindly uncle. None of them realized they were being evaluated, measured, cataloged for future use. His first official victim was Julia Smythe, a young woman who worked in his pharmacy. She was beautiful, intelligent, and completely devoted to Holmes. She believed his promises of marriage, his declarations of love, his assurances that they would build a life together. Instead, he led her to a specially designed room on the second floor, a chamber with walls lined with asbestos and a gas pipe connected to the basement. Holmes sealed her inside and slowly filled the room with poison gas, watching through a hidden peephole as she clawed at the walls and screamed for help. When she finally collapsed, he waited another hour to ensure death, then retrieved her body for dissection. He removed her skeleton with surgical precision, cleaned the bones with acid, and added them to his growing collection in the basement. Julia's disappearance was explained as a sudden departure for family reasons. Holmes forged a letter in her handwriting, expressing regret at leaving without notice. Her friends were sad, but not suspicious. In the 1890s in Chicago, people disappeared all the time, seeking new opportunities in the expanding frontier. The pattern was established. Holmes would befriend his victims, gain their trust, then lure them to his castle for various pretexts. Some came for medical consultations, others were promised jobs or romantic encounters. A few were simply in the wrong place when Holmes felt the urge to kill. His methods varied depending on his mood and the victim's characteristics. Some were gassed like Julia. Others were locked in soundproof rooms and left to starve. He had a stretching rack that could dislocate every joint in the human body. An airtight vault where victims suffocated slowly while he listened to their final gasps through speaking tubes. But the killing was only the beginning. Holmes was as interested in death as he was in the process of dying. He would spend hours dissecting his victims, studying their anatomy, learning how different bodies responded to various forms of trauma. He kept detailed notes on decomposition rates, bone density, the effects of different acids on human tissue. The skeletons were his masterpieces. He would strip away flesh and organs with the skill of a master butcher, then clean and preserve the bones using techniques he had learned in medical school. Each skeleton was cataloged and stored in specially designed cabinets in the basement. He arranged them by height, age, gender, creating a macabre museum of his accomplishments. Holmes sold some of the skeletons to medical schools and private collectors, claiming they were legally obtained cadavers. The money helped fund his operations and maintain his respectable facade, but his favorite specimens he kept for himself, visiting them like old friends, running his fingers along familiar femurs and rib cages. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition brought millions of visitors to Chicago, and Holmes saw opportunity. He advertised rooms for rent in his building, offering clean accommodations at reasonable rates. Tourists arrived daily, eager to see the fair and experience the excitement of the big city. Many never left. Holmes had perfected his system by then. He could kill, dissect, and dispose of a body in less than 6 hours. The furnaces in his basement burned constantly, consuming flesh and organs while preserving the valuable bones. The acid baths dissolved what couldn't be burned. Nothing was wasted. He began taking photographs of his victims before and after death, creating a visual record of his work. The before pictures showed smiling faces, people excited about their Chicago adventure. The after pictures captured the moment of death, eyes wide with terror and understanding. Holmes kept these photographs in albums, organized chronologically like family vacation pictures. One victim, a young man named Benjamin Pittisell, became Holmes's business partner before becoming his prey. Pittisell helped Holmes with various insurance frauds and confidence schemes, never realizing he was being groomed for a more permanent role. When Holmes finally killed him, he used Pittisell's death as part of an elaborate insurance scam, collecting money while adding another skeleton to his collection. But Holmes's appetite was growing beyond individual murders. He began targeting entire families, luring them to his castle with promises of employment or investment opportunities. The Pittisell family lost not just Benjamin, but 3 of his children, all killed and dissected by Holmes over the course of several months. By 1894, Holmes had murdered at least 200 people, though he claimed the number was closer to 300. His basement contained the largest private collection of human skeletons in America, each one representing a life cut short for his pleasure and profit. He had become a one-man industry of death, processing human beings like livestock. The end came through simple greed. Holmes attempted one insurance fraud too many, involving a fake death that investigators were able to unravel. When police searched his building, they found the murder rooms, the acid baths, the furnaces, and the bone collection. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Holmes was arrested in 1894 and put on trial for murder. He confessed to 27 killings, but investigators believed the true number was much higher. Many of his victims were never identified, their bones mixed together in his macabre collection. Entire families had vanished without trace, their disappearances explained away by Holmes's forged letters and false stories. During his trial, Holmes showed no remorse for his crimes. He spoke about his victims like a collector discussing rare specimens, noting their unique characteristics and the challenges they had presented. He seemed proud of his technical skills, his ability to kill efficiently and dispose of evidence completely. He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was executed at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. His last words were a request that his own body be buried in concrete to prevent anyone from stealing his bones for study. Even in death, he understood the value of a good skeleton. The murder castle was partially destroyed by fire shortly after Holmes's arrest, though some claimed he had arranged the blaze from his jail cell to destroy remaining evidence. The basement was sealed and filled with concrete. The building was eventually demolished, but locals claimed the ground remained cursed, that nothing would grow where Holmes had practiced his craft. For decades, the true extent of Holmes's crimes remained hidden. Police had destroyed much of the evidence, considering it too disturbing for public consumption. The bone collection was scattered, some specimens donated to medical schools, others simply buried in unmarked graves. But in 1962, when construction workers found that buried cache of bones, the truth began to emerge. Forensic analysis revealed that the skeletons belonged to men, women, and children who had died violently. Cut marks on the bones showed evidence of systematic dissection. Chemical residue indicated exposure to acids and other preservatives. Among the bones, investigators found Holmes's journals wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved in a metal box. The pages contained detailed descriptions of his murders, sketches of his victims, and technical notes on bone preservation. One entry, dated December 1893, read, "Acquired 3 new specimens today. A family from Iowa, very well preserved teeth. The father's femur shows interesting stress fractures. The mother's skull will make an excellent addition to my cranial studies." The journals revealed that Holmes had been far more than a simple serial killer. He had been conducting systematic studies of human anatomy, using murder as a means of scientific research. He had developed new techniques for bone preservation, created detailed anatomical drawings, and maintained meticulous records of his findings. Today, Herman Webster Mudgett is remembered as one of America's first serial killers, but few people know about his bone collection or his systematic approach to murder. The evidence was too disturbing, the scope too vast, the implications too horrifying for complete public disclosure. But the bones, remember? In medical schools across the country, students study skeletons that may have once belonged to Holmes's victims. In private collections, specimens bear the marks of his surgical skills. And somewhere in Chicago, in the ground where his murder castle once stood, fragments of his work still lie buried, waiting to be discovered by the next generation of construction workers. Holmes proved that evil could wear the mask of respectability, that monsters could hide behind medical degrees and charming smiles. He showed that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy, most professional, most normal. In the end, he collected more than bones. He collected lives, dreams, futures, families. And his true legacy isn't the building he constructed or the crimes he committed, but the reminder that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones who never seem monstrous at all. In the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, where Amish farms stretched toward distant mountains, and the only sounds were wind through wheat and the clip-clop of horse hooves, there lived a man who called himself Brother Samuel. To his followers, he was a prophet, a healer, a direct conduit to God's will. To the outside world, he was Samuel Stoltzfus, a charismatic preacher who had built a thriving religious community from nothing. But in the basement of his sprawling compound, beneath the chapel where hundreds gathered to hear his sermons, Samuel kept a different kind of congregation. Bodies arranged in neat rows, their faces peaceful in death, their hands folded in eternal prayer. He called them his perfected souls, believers who had achieved the ultimate communion with the divine through his guidance. Between 1987 and 1994, Samuel murdered 43 members of his religious community, convincing each one that their death was a sacred calling, a necessary step towards spiritual enlightenment. But what made him truly terrifying wasn't just the killing. It was the way he made his victims grateful for the privilege of dying by his hand. Samuel Stoltzfus was born in 1952 in Lancaster County, the heart of Pennsylvania Dutch country. His family were Old Order Amish, living without electricity or modern conveniences, following traditions that stretched back centuries. But Samuel was different from his siblings, marked by an intelligence and charisma that set him apart from the quiet, humble community around him. As a child, Samuel showed an unusual fascination with death and the afterlife. While other Amish children played simple games or helped with farm chores, Samuel would spend hours in the family cemetery, studying headstones and asking endless questions about what happened to souls after death. His parents, devout but simple people, encouraged his spiritual curiosity, believing it showed a calling to religious leadership. But Samuel's interests went beyond normal theological inquiry. He began conducting what he called experiments in faith, testing the limits of belief and devotion among his younger siblings and cousins. He would convince them to fast for days, telling them that hunger brought them closer to God. He persuaded them to inflict pain on themselves, claiming that suffering purified the soul. When Samuel was 16, his youngest sister, Rebecca, died during one of these experiments. Samuel had convinced her to drink a mixture of herbs and roots he claimed would induce religious visions. Instead, the concoction poisoned her, causing convulsions and respiratory failure. As she lay dying, Samuel held her hand and whispered that she was being called home by God, that her death was a blessing. The family was devastated, but Samuel showed no remorse. He spoke at Rebecca's funeral, delivering a sermon about how God sometimes chose the purest souls for early salvation. His words were so moving, so filled with apparent grief and spiritual insight, that the community praised his strength in the face of tragedy. No one suspected that he had orchestrated his sister's death. The incident awakened something in Samuel, a realization of the power he could wield over others through their faith. He began studying the Bible with obsessive intensity, memorizing entire books, learning to quote scripture with the authority of divine inspiration. But his interpretation of Christian doctrine was twisted, filtered through his growing belief that he had been chosen as God's instrument on earth. At 18, Samuel left the Amish community, claiming he had received a vision calling him to spread God's word beyond the confines of traditional religion. He traveled throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, preaching at small churches and revival meetings, gathering followers who were drawn to his passionate sermons and apparent spiritual gifts. Samuel had a gift for identifying vulnerable people, those who were searching for meaning, struggling with loss, or desperate for belonging. He would approach them after his sermons, speaking softly about their pain, offering comfort and understanding that seemed to come from divine insight. Within weeks, these broken souls would abandon their old lives to follow him. By 1985, Samuel had established his own religious community on a 200-acre farm in rural Pennsylvania. He called it the Sanctuary of Perfect Peace, and it attracted followers from across the country. They lived communally, sharing resources and labor, dedicating their lives to prayer and service under Samuel's guidance. To outsiders, the sanctuary appeared to be a model religious community. The members were clean, well-fed, and radiantly happy. They spoke of Samuel with reverence, describing miraculous healings and prophetic visions. Local authorities had no reason to investigate, and the community's isolation made outside scrutiny difficult. But within the sanctuary, Samuel was building something far more sinister than a religious commune. He had developed a theology of spiritual perfection that required the complete surrender of individual will to divine authority. He taught that true believers must be willing to sacrifice everything, including their lives, if God demanded it. Samuel's first murder within the community was carefully planned and executed. He chose Martha Yoder, an elderly woman who had donated her life savings to the sanctuary and had no family outside the community. Samuel spent weeks preparing her spiritually, conducting private counseling sessions where he gradually introduced the idea that God might be calling her to a higher form of service. "Sister Martha," he would say during their sessions, "I sense that the Lord has special plans for you. You have such pure faith, such devotion. I believe you may be chosen for the ultimate blessing." Martha was flattered by the attention, honored to be singled out by the prophet she worshipped. When Samuel finally revealed that God wanted her to transition to perfect communion, she accepted the calling without question. She even thanked him for the privilege of being chosen. Samuel administered the poison during a private communion service, telling Martha that the bitter taste was a sign of the sacred transformation taking place within her body. As she convulsed and died, he held her hands and spoke softly about the glorious reunion awaiting her in heaven. Her final words were expressions of gratitude for being allowed to serve God in this ultimate way. Martha's death was announced to the community as a miraculous translation, a direct ascension to heaven without the normal process of decay and burial. Samuel claimed that her body had been transformed into pure spirit, that she had achieved the perfect state all believers should aspire to reach. The community was awed by this apparent miracle, and several members approached Samuel privately, asking if they too might be worthy of such a blessing. Samuel was careful in his selections, choosing only those who were completely devoted, who had no outside connections, who would not be missed by the outside world. Over the next several years, Samuel refined his methods and expanded his theology of spiritual perfection. He established a hierarchy within the community, with an inner circle of perfected souls who had achieved the highest level of spiritual development. Members competed for inclusion in this elite group, not realizing that membership meant death. Samuel developed elaborate rituals around the transition process. Chosen members would undergo weeks of preparation, fasting, and praying, purifying themselves for the sacred transformation. The community would gather for special ceremonies where Samuel would announce God's selection of another soul for perfection. The actual murders took place in a specially prepared chamber beneath the chapel, a room Samuel called the Sanctum of Transition. The walls were painted with religious imagery, and soft music played during the ceremonies. Samuel would dress in white robes and speak in hushed, reverent tones as he administered the poison. Each victim died believing they were experiencing the ultimate religious ecstasy. Samuel had convinced them that the pain and fear were necessary parts of the transformation, that their suffering was purifying their souls for entry into heaven. Some even smiled as they died, grateful for the privilege of being chosen. Samuel preserved the bodies in the basement, arranging them in rows like a congregation frozen in eternal worship. He told the community that the perfected souls remained present in spirit, that their bodies were sacred relics that blessed the entire sanctuary. Members would sometimes request permission to visit the basement, to pray in the presence of those who had achieved ultimate spiritual perfection. But Samuel's appetite for control was growing beyond simple murder. He began targeting families within the community, convincing parents that their children had been chosen for special blessings. The Brennan family lost 3 children over the course of 2 years, each death explained as a divine calling that should be celebrated rather than mourned. Samuel had developed a sophisticated psychological manipulation system that made his victims complicit in their own deaths. He would spend months grooming each target, gradually introducing concepts of sacrifice and spiritual transformation, building their sense of being specially chosen by God. By the time he revealed their fate, they were so psychologically conditioned that they welcomed death as a privilege. The community's isolation helped Samuel maintain control over information and perception. Members had no access to outside media, no contact with former friends or family. Their entire reality was shaped by Samuel's teachings and interpretations. When people disappeared, their absence was explained as spiritual advancement rather than death. Samuel also used the threat of spiritual damnation to maintain discipline. He taught that questioning his authority was equivalent to questioning God, that doubt was a sign of spiritual weakness that could result in eternal punishment. Members policed themselves and each other, reporting any signs of wavering faith to Samuel for correction. The end came in 1994 when a former member who had escaped the community contacted federal authorities with stories of mass murder disguised as religious practice. The FBI initially dismissed the claims as the ravings of a disgruntled cult member, but persistent pressure from the escapee's family eventually led to an investigation. When federal agents raided the Sanctuary of Perfect Peace, they found a community of believers who genuinely thought they were living in paradise. The surviving members defended Samuel passionately, insisting that the agents were servants of Satan sent to destroy their holy community. Even when shown the basement full of bodies, many refused to believe that their beloved prophet was a murderer. The evidence was overwhelming. Samuel had kept detailed records of each transition, documenting his victims' spiritual preparation and final moments. He had photographed the bodies in their peaceful poses, creating what he called a gallery of perfected souls. His journals revealed the calculated nature of his crimes, the careful selection of victims, the psychological techniques he used to ensure compliance. During his trial, Samuel showed no remorse for his actions. He insisted that he had been following God's direct commands, that his victims had achieved the highest possible spiritual state through their deaths. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the prosecution's characterization of his actions as murder, maintaining that he had performed sacred religious ceremonies. "I am a shepherd of souls," he told the court. "I have guided my flock to the ultimate destination, the perfect communion with the divine that all believers seek. These people died in a state of pure faith, grateful for the blessing I was able to provide. How can that be called murder?" The jury was horrified by Samuel's complete lack of remorse and his continued insistence that his crimes were religious acts. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. Even on death row, Samuel continued to attract followers, receiving letters from people who believed in his divine mission and wanted to join his perfected congregation. Samuel Stoltzfus was executed by lethal injection in 1999. His final words were a prayer thanking God for allowing him to serve as an instrument of divine will. He died believing that he would be reunited with his victims in heaven, where they would continue their perfect worship for eternity. The Sanctuary of Perfect Peace was disbanded, its surviving members scattered to the winds. Many struggled to readjust to life outside the community, their faith shattered by the revelation of Samuel's true nature. Some never recovered from the psychological trauma of discovering that their spiritual paradise had been built on mass murder. The case revealed the terrifying power of religious manipulation, the way charismatic leaders could use faith as a weapon against the faithful. Samuel had proven that the most dangerous predators are often those who claim to speak for God, who use divine authority to justify the most unholy acts. Today, the abandoned sanctuary stands as a monument to the victims of religious extremism. The basement where Samuel kept his congregation of the dead has been sealed, but locals claim the building still feels haunted by the souls who died believing they were achieving spiritual perfection. Samuel Stoltzfus showed that evil could wear the robes of righteousness, that murder could be disguised as salvation. He proved that the most vulnerable victims are often those who trust most completely, who surrender their judgment to leaders who claim divine authority. In the end, he killed not for money or power or pleasure, but for the godlike satisfaction of controlling life and death through faith. He was a shepherd who led his flock not to green pastures, but to the slaughter, convincing them that death was the ultimate blessing he could provide. In the quiet university town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, where autumn leaves crunched underfoot and the smell of old books drifted from ivy-covered buildings, students would sometimes joke about the librarian who worked the night shift. They called him the Midnight Librarian, a pale, thin man who seemed to know exactly which book you needed before you even asked. What they didn't know was that Professor Edmund Blackwood was writing his own book, one chapter at a time, using their bodies as pages. Between 1976 and 1983, Blackwood murdered 19 students, each death carefully orchestrated to appear accidental or natural. But these weren't random killings. They were research, part of an elaborate study into what he called the literature of death, a twisted academic pursuit that turned murder into methodology and victims into footnotes in his macabre dissertation. Edmund Blackwood had been born into academic royalty in 1934, the son of a Harvard philosophy professor and a Radcliffe literature scholar. His childhood was spent in faculty lounges and lecture halls, surrounded by the musty smell of old books and the hushed conversations of intellectuals. While other children played with toys, Edmund played with ideas, concepts, theories that most adults struggle to understand. But there was something cold about young Edmund's brilliance. He approached human emotion like a scientific specimen, studying grief and joy with the same detached curiosity he brought to mathematical equations. His parents, absorbed in their own scholarly pursuits, mistook his emotional distance for intellectual sophistication. At 12, Edmund conducted his first experiment in what he would later call mortality studies. He convinced his younger cousin, Timothy, to participate in a game that involved holding his breath underwater for increasingly longer periods. Edmund timed each attempt with scientific precision, taking notes on Timothy's physical responses, his facial expressions, the exact moment when panic set in. The final attempt lasted too long. Timothy drowned in the family's pond while Edmund watched, stopwatch in hand, documenting the precise sequence of events that led from consciousness to death. When adults arrived, Edmund calmly explained that Timothy had been trying to break a swimming record and had tragically miscalculated his abilities. The death was ruled accidental, but Edmund had learned something profound about the power of observation, the intoxicating rush of witnessing the transition from life to death. He began seeking out opportunities to study mortality, volunteering at hospitals, attending funerals, always watching, always taking notes. By the time Edmund reached graduate school at Yale, he had developed a reputation as a brilliant but eccentric scholar specializing in thanatology, the academic study of death, dying, and bereavement. His professors praised his innovative research methods and his ability to approach morbid subjects with scientific objectivity. They had no idea that his objectivity came from direct observation of death in its most intimate moments. Edmund's doctoral dissertation, Narrative Structures in Terminal Experience, was groundbreaking in its field. He had somehow gained access to detailed accounts of dying experiences, first-person narratives that captured the psychological and physical progression from life to death with unprecedented accuracy. The academic community was amazed by the authenticity of his source material, never suspecting that Edmund had created those narratives himself by murdering his subjects. In 1975, Edmund accepted a position at Millbrook University as an assistant professor of comparative literature with a specialty in death studies. The small New England campus was perfect for his purposes, isolated enough to avoid scrutiny, but populated with the young, intelligent subjects his research required. Edmund's first victim at Millbrook was Sarah Chen, a graduate student in philosophy who had approached him for guidance on her thesis about existential anxiety. She was brilliant, articulate, and completely trusting of her distinguished professor. Edmund spent weeks cultivating their relationship, positioning himself as a mentor and father figure. During their private meetings in his office, Edmund would steer conversations toward death and dying, probing Sarah's thoughts about mortality with the skill of a trained therapist. He was particularly interested in her fears, her beliefs about what happened after death, her emotional responses to the concept of non-existence. "Tell me, Sarah," he would say during their sessions, "when you imagine your own death, what do you see? What do you feel? Don't intellectualize it. Give me the raw, emotional truth." Sarah, eager to impress her mentor, would share her deepest anxieties and philosophical struggles. Edmund recorded everything, ostensibly for academic purposes, but actually as preparation for what he called her final contribution to scholarship. The murder took place in Edmund's private study, a book-lined sanctuary where he conducted his most sensitive research. He had invited Sarah for an evening discussion about her thesis, promising to share some rare texts that would enhance her work. She arrived excited and grateful, completely unaware that she was about to become the subject of Edmund's most intimate study. Edmund had prepared a special tea, laced with a paralytic agent that would render Sarah conscious but unable to move or speak. As the drug took effect, he explained what was happening with the calm, measured tone he used in lectures. "Sarah, you're about to participate in the most important research of your academic career," he said, settling into a chair beside her paralyzed form. "I'm going to document your transition from life to death with unprecedented precision. Your experience will contribute to humanity's understanding of mortality in ways that traditional scholarship never could." Over the next several hours, Edmund administered carefully measured doses of various toxins, monitoring Sarah's vital signs and documenting her responses. He was particularly interested in her eyes, which remained conscious and aware even as her body shut down. He photographed her facial expressions, recorded her vital signs, and spoke continuously into a tape recorder, creating a real-time narrative of the dying process. "Subject exhibits dilated pupils at 9:47 p.m., he would note clinically. "Respiratory rate decreasing. Note the fascinating interplay between consciousness and physical deterioration. The subject appears to be experiencing what Heidegger would call authentic being toward death." Sarah's death took nearly 6 hours, during which Edmund gathered more detailed data about the dying process than any researcher in history. When she finally expired, he felt a satisfaction deeper than any academic achievement. He had witnessed the ultimate human experience and documented it with scientific rigor. Sarah's death was attributed to a rare allergic reaction that had triggered respiratory failure. Edmund, as her mentor, was praised for his attempts to save her life and his dignified handling of the tragedy. The university held a memorial service where Edmund delivered a moving eulogy about Sarah's intellectual promise and her contributions to philosophical discourse. But Sarah was just the beginning. Edmund had discovered that murder could be the ultimate research methodology, providing insights into human nature that no amount of theoretical study could match. He began selecting subjects from among his students, choosing those who were isolated, intellectually curious, and unlikely to be missed immediately. Each murder was designed as a controlled experiment. Edmund would vary his methods, testing different toxins, different psychological approaches, different environmental conditions. He was particularly interested in how knowledge of impending death affected the dying process, so he began revealing his intentions to some victims while keeping others ignorant. Michael Torres, a senior majoring in psychology, became Edmund's test subject for what he called informed mortality. Edmund spent weeks preparing Michael psychologically, gradually introducing the concept that death could be a transcendent experience, a form of ultimate knowledge that few humans ever achieved. Imagine, Michael, Edmund would say during their discussions, if you could experience death consciously, scientifically, contributing to human knowledge while achieving the ultimate understanding. Wouldn't that be the greatest possible contribution a scholar could make? When Edmund finally revealed that Michael had been chosen for this honor, the young man was so psychologically conditioned that he actually felt privileged. He thanked Edmund for selecting him, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to contribute to such important research. Michael's death was documented with even greater precision than Sarah's. Edmund had refined his techniques, developing new instruments for measuring brain activity during the dying process. He was particularly fascinated by the moment of clinical death, the exact instant when consciousness ceased and the body became merely biological matter. The pattern continued for years. Edmund would identify promising subjects, cultivate relationships with them, then conduct his lethal experiments under the guise of academic research. He developed a sophisticated system for disposing of evidence and explaining deaths, always maintaining his reputation as a dedicated educator who cared deeply about his students. Edmund's academic career flourished alongside his murderous research. He published groundbreaking papers on death studies, delivered lectures at prestigious conferences, and was considered one of the leading experts in thanatology. His insights into the dying process were so accurate and detailed that colleagues marveled at his intuitive understanding of mortality. But Edmund's appetite for knowledge was growing beyond simple observation. He began experimenting with different types of subjects, testing how various personality types responded to the dying process. He murdered athletes to study physical resilience, artists to examine creative responses to mortality, scientists to observe analytical approaches to death. One victim, Jennifer Walsh, was a talented creative writing student whom Edmund selected specifically for her imaginative capabilities. He was curious about how a creative mind would process the experience of dying, whether artistic sensibility would produce unique insights into mortality. Edmund's approach with Jennifer was particularly elaborate. He convinced her to participate in what he called an immersive writing exercise that would involve experiencing altered states of consciousness to enhance her creative output. She was thrilled by the opportunity to work with such a distinguished professor on cutting-edge artistic methodology. The experiment took place over several days, with Edmund gradually introducing psychoactive substances while encouraging Jennifer to document her experiences in writing. As her condition deteriorated, he guided her to write about her sensations, her thoughts, her evolving understanding of consciousness and reality. Jennifer's final writings, produced as she was dying, became some of Edmund's most treasured research materials. Her descriptions of the dying process from an artist's perspective provided insights that purely scientific observation could never capture. Edmund preserved her handwritten pages like sacred texts, studying them for years afterward. By 1982, Edmund had murdered 18 students and was planning his masterpiece, a comprehensive study that would document multiple deaths simultaneously, allowing him to compare different responses to identical conditions. He selected 5 students for what he called his Mortality Symposium, a group experiment that would represent the culmination of his research. But Edmund's ambition proved his downfall. The simultaneous disappearance of 5 students triggered an investigation that his usual methods couldn't deflect. Federal agents began examining patterns in student deaths over the previous decade, and Edmund's name appeared too frequently in the files of deceased students. When authorities searched Edmund's private study, they found his complete research archive, thousands of pages of notes, photographs, recordings, and preserved specimens documenting his years of murderous experimentation. The evidence was so extensive and horrifying that investigators initially refused to believe it was real. Edmund showed no remorse when confronted with the evidence. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' horror at his work, insisting that his research represented the greatest advancement in thanatological studies in human history. He offered to share his findings with the scientific community, believing that his contributions to knowledge justified his methods. "I have documented the human experience of dying with unprecedented precision," he told investigators. "My research has revealed truths about mortality that philosophers and scientists have speculated about for centuries. These students didn't simply die. They contributed to the advancement of human knowledge in the most profound way possible." During his trial, Edmund attempted to present his crimes as legitimate academic research, arguing that the pursuit of knowledge justified any methodology. He seemed genuinely confused by the prosecution's characterization of his work as murder, maintaining that he was a scholar who had simply chosen an unconventional research approach. The jury was horrified by Edmund's complete lack of remorse and his continued insistence that his victims should be grateful for their contributions to science. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Edmund continued his research, studying the mortality experiences of fellow inmates and corresponding with academics who were fascinated by his work despite its horrific methodology. He spent his final years writing a comprehensive analysis of his findings, hoping to preserve his research for future scholars. Edmund Blackwood died in prison in 2003, still believing that his murderous experiments represented legitimate scientific inquiry. His research materials were destroyed by court order, but copies allegedly survive in private collections, studied by researchers who are simultaneously horrified and fascinated by their unprecedented insights into human mortality. The case revealed the terrifying potential for academic authority to mask the most heinous crimes. Edmund had used his position as an educator to gain access to victims, his scholarly reputation to deflect suspicion, and his intellectual framework to justify murder as research. Today, Millbrook University has implemented strict protocols for faculty-student interactions, but Edmund's legacy lingers in the academic community's awareness that the pursuit of knowledge can become a justification for evil. He proved that the most dangerous predators are sometimes those who claim to seek truth, who use intellectual authority to mask their darkest impulses. In the end, Edmund Blackwood killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of possessing ultimate knowledge about the human condition. He was a scholar who turned murder into methodology, transforming his victims into unwilling contributors to his macabre dissertation on death. His story serves as a reminder that evil can wear the robes of academia, that the most sophisticated minds can harbor the most primitive impulses, and that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who claim to be advancing human understanding while destroying human lives. In the abandoned subway tunnels beneath New York City, where the darkness swallows sound and the air tastes of rust and decay, a man named Vincent Torino built his underground kingdom. To the homeless who sheltered in the tunnels, he was a savior who offered food and protection. To the city above, he was invisible, another ghost in the labyrinth of forgotten infrastructure. But in the deepest chambers of his domain, Vincent was conducting a symphony of suffering that would claim 34 lives over 8 years. Vincent didn't kill for money or revenge or sexual gratification. He killed because he believed human screams, when properly orchestrated, could unlock the secrets of the universe. Each victim became an instrument in his grotesque orchestra, their dying cries carefully recorded and analyzed in his quest to decode what he called the language of ultimate truth. Vincent Torino was born in 1951 in the Bronx, the son of a subway maintenance worker who spent his days in the tunnels beneath the city. As a child, Vincent would sometimes accompany his father to work, wandering through the maze of abandoned stations and forgotten passages that honeycombed Manhattan's underground. While other children feared the darkness, Vincent found it comforting, a place where the chaos of the surface world couldn't reach him. But Vincent was different in ways that went beyond his comfort with darkness. He possessed perfect pitch and an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between different types of sounds. He could identify the emotional state of a person by the subtle variations in their voice, could tell if someone was lying by the microscopic changes in their breathing patterns. This gift manifested early in disturbing ways. Vincent would spend hours listening to recordings of people in distress, accident victims, patients in emergency rooms, children crying in playgrounds. He claimed he was studying the acoustic signatures of human emotion, but his fascination went deeper than academic curiosity. He believed that extreme emotional states produced sounds that contained hidden information about the nature of consciousness itself. At 15, Vincent conducted his first experiment in what he called sonic extraction. He had befriended a stray cat in his neighborhood, gaining its trust over several weeks. Then, in the basement of his family's apartment building, he began systematically torturing the animal while recording its cries with equipment he had stolen from his high school's audiovisual department. Vincent spent months analyzing those recordings, convinced that the cat's screams contained patterns that revealed something profound about the experience of suffering. He created detailed charts mapping the frequency and duration of different vocalizations, searching for what he believed was a universal language of pain. When his parents discovered the recordings and the cat's remains, they were horrified but chose to handle the situation privately. Vincent's father, a simple man who worked with his hands, couldn't understand his son's obsession with sound and suffering. His mother, overwhelmed by the implications of what she had found, convinced herself that Vincent was going through a phase that would pass with time. But Vincent's interests only intensified as he grew older. He enrolled in audio engineering courses, learning to use sophisticated recording and analysis equipment. He studied acoustics, psychology, and neuroscience, always searching for scientific validation of his belief that sound could unlock the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. By his early 20s, Vincent had developed a comprehensive theory about what he called terminal acoustics, the idea that humans produce their most truthful and revealing sounds when facing death. He believed that the approach of mortality stripped away all pretense and social conditioning, allowing the pure essence of consciousness to express itself through vocalization. Vincent's first human victim was a homeless man named Eddie Kowalski, whom he encountered in the subway tunnels during one of his exploratory expeditions. Eddie was dying of pneumonia, coughing up blood, and struggling to breathe in the damp underground air. Vincent offered to help, leading Eddie to a deeper section of tunnel where he claimed there was medical assistance. Instead, Vincent had prepared a makeshift recording studio in an abandoned maintenance chamber. As Eddie's condition worsened, Vincent documented every sound, the wet rattle of his breathing, the weak moans of pain, the final gasping breaths before death. He was fascinated by the acoustic progression from life to death, the way Eddie's vocalizations changed as his body shut down. Eddie's death was attributed to natural causes, another homeless casualty that the city barely noticed. But Vincent had recorded over 6 hours of what he considered the most authentic human sounds ever captured. He spent weeks analyzing the recordings, convinced that Eddie's dying breaths contained revelations about the nature of consciousness that no living person had ever accessed. The experience was transformative for Vincent. He realized that the subway tunnels provided the perfect laboratory for his research, isolated, soundproof, and populated with people whose disappearances would go unnoticed. He began establishing himself as a protector and provider for the tunnel's homeless population, offering food, blankets, and protection from the dangers of underground life. Vincent's victims trusted him completely. He was the man who brought them hot meals, who knew their names, who listened to their stories without judgment. They had no idea that he was evaluating them as potential subjects for his acoustic experiments, studying their voices and emotional patterns to determine who would provide the most valuable research data. His methods became increasingly sophisticated. Vincent constructed soundproof chambers in the deepest parts of the tunnel system, rooms lined with acoustic foam and equipped with professional recording equipment. He developed techniques for prolonging the dying process, using medical knowledge to keep victims conscious and vocal for as long as possible. Maria Santos was a young runaway who had been living in the tunnels for 3 months when Vincent selected her for his research. She was intelligent, articulate, and possessed what Vincent considered an exceptionally expressive voice. He spent weeks gaining her trust, positioning himself as a father figure who could protect her from the dangers of street life. When Vincent finally revealed his true intentions, Maria was too shocked to resist effectively. He had drugged her food with a paralytic agent that left her conscious but unable to move. As she lay helpless in his recording chamber, Vincent explained his research with the enthusiasm of a scientist describing a breakthrough discovery. "Maria, you're going to help me unlock one of the greatest mysteries in human history," he said, adjusting his recording equipment. "The sounds you make in the next few hours will reveal truths about consciousness that philosophers have debated for centuries. Your voice will become part of something much larger than yourself." Vincent's torture of Maria was methodical and scientific. He used various instruments to inflict pain while carefully monitoring her vocal responses. He was particularly interested in how different types of suffering produced different acoustic signatures. The sharp, staccato screams of sudden pain versus the low, sustained moans of prolonged agony. Maria's ordeal lasted 14 hours, during which Vincent recorded every sound she made. He took detailed notes on the correlation between specific injuries and vocal patterns, mapping what he called the acoustic geography of suffering. When she finally died, Vincent felt he had captured the most complete documentation of human terminal experience ever recorded. But Vincent's research was expanding beyond simple documentation. He began experimenting with what he called harmonic suffering, the idea that multiple victims dying simultaneously would produce acoustic interactions that revealed even deeper truths. He started selecting groups of victims, orchestrating their deaths to create what he considered symphonies of human consciousness. One of his most elaborate experiments involved 5 homeless veterans who had formed a close-knit group in the tunnels. Vincent had observed their interactions for months, studying their vocal patterns and emotional bonds. He believed that their shared trauma and mutual affection would produce unique acoustic phenomena when they faced death together. Vincent drugged all 5 men during a communal meal, then arranged them in his largest recording chamber. As they regained consciousness and realized their situation, their voices created what Vincent considered a masterpiece of terminal acoustics. The interplay of their screams, their attempts to comfort each other, their final expressions of love and despair, produced sounds that Vincent believed contained the essence of human connection itself. The recording of their deaths became Vincent's most treasured possession. He would listen to it for hours, analyzing every nuance, every harmonic interaction, every moment where individual voices merged into something larger. He was convinced that he had captured the sound of souls departing the physical world, the acoustic signature of consciousness transitioning to whatever lay beyond death. Vincent's underground kingdom grew more elaborate as his research progressed. He constructed multiple recording chambers, each designed for different types of experiments. He developed a classification system for different types of screams, creating what he called a periodic table of human suffering that categorized vocalizations by emotional content, physical cause, and acoustic properties. But Vincent's most ambitious project was what he called the terminal chorus, a plan to record the simultaneous deaths of dozens of victims, creating what he believed would be the ultimate expression of human consciousness. He began stockpiling subjects in holding chambers, keeping them alive but weakened, preparing for a mass experiment that would represent the culmination of his research. The end came in 1987, when a transit worker exploring abandoned sections of tunnel discovered one of Vincent's recording chambers. The room contained sophisticated audio equipment, restraint devices, and the remains of several victims. The discovery triggered a massive investigation that revealed the full scope of Vincent's underground operation. When police finally located Vincent in his deepest chamber, they found him surrounded by thousands of hours of recordings, detailed charts analyzing vocal patterns, and notebooks filled with theories about the acoustic properties of human suffering. He was in the process of preparing for his terminal chorus experiment, with 12 victims restrained and ready for what he called his final symphony. Vincent showed no resistance when arrested, seeming almost relieved that his work would finally receive the recognition he believed it deserved. He eagerly explained his research to investigators, playing recordings and sharing his analysis of different vocal patterns. He seemed genuinely puzzled by their horror at his methods, insisting that his discoveries about human consciousness justified any means necessary to obtain them. "I have recorded the sound of the human soul," he told detectives. "I have captured the acoustic signature of consciousness itself departing the physical world. These recordings contain truths about the nature of existence that no one has ever documented before. This is the most important research in human history." During his trial, Vincent attempted to present his crimes as legitimate scientific research, arguing that his discoveries about terminal acoustics represented a breakthrough in understanding human consciousness. He played excerpts from his recordings for the court, providing clinical analysis of the vocal patterns while seemingly oblivious to the horror his evidence produced. The jury was traumatized by Vincent's recordings and his complete lack of remorse for his victims' suffering. They convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even after conviction, Vincent continued to insist that his research would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking scientific work. In prison, Vincent attempted to continue his research by studying the vocalizations of other inmates. He was eventually placed in solitary confinement after guards discovered that he was deliberately provoking fights and recording the sounds of violence with improvised equipment. Vincent Torino died in prison in 2003, still believing that his recordings contained revelations about human consciousness that the world wasn't ready to understand. His research materials were destroyed by court order, though rumors persist that copies exist in private collections studied by researchers fascinated by his unique insights into the acoustic properties of human suffering. The case revealed the terrifying potential for scientific curiosity to become justification for the most heinous crimes. Vincent had used his knowledge of acoustics and psychology to transform murder into what he considered legitimate research, turning his victims' final moments into data points in his grotesque study of human consciousness. Today, the abandoned subway tunnels where Vincent conducted his experiments remain largely unexplored, their darkness hiding the echoes of his victims' final screams. His story serves as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who claim to seek knowledge, who use scientific methodology to mask their darkest impulses. Vincent Torino proved that evil could wear the mask of scientific inquiry, that the pursuit of knowledge could become a justification for unspeakable cruelty. He showed that the most sophisticated minds could harbor the most primitive impulses, transforming intellectual curiosity into an instrument of torture and death. In the end, he killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing he could decode the ultimate mysteries of human existence through the systematic documentation of suffering. He was a conductor who orchestrated symphonies of agony, believing that in the screams of the dying, he could hear the voice of truth itself. In the sterile corridors of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital in Oregon, where the fluorescent lights hummed constantly and the smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of despair, Dr. Margaret Holloway walked among her patients like a benevolent goddess. To the staff, she was a brilliant psychiatrist who had revolutionized treatment for severe mental illness. To her patients, she was salvation itself, the doctor who could reach into their broken minds and extract the pain that tormented them. But in the basement of the hospital, behind a door marked private research, authorized personnel only, Dr. Holloway was conducting experiments that would have horrified even the most hardened investigators. Between 1979 and 1986, she murdered 27 patients, not for money or pleasure, but because she believed she could steal their memories, their experiences, their very essence, and add them to her own consciousness. Margaret Holloway was born in 1943 in rural Montana, the daughter of a country doctor who treated everything from broken bones to broken minds with equal dedication. Her childhood was spent in her father's clinic, watching him work, absorbing his knowledge, developing an early fascination with the human brain and its infinite capacity for both creation and destruction. But Margaret was different from other children in ways that went beyond intellectual precocity. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to understand their thoughts and emotions with uncanny accuracy. She could look into someone's eyes and know their deepest fears, their most cherished memories, their hidden shames and secret desires. This gift manifested in disturbing ways during her adolescence. Margaret would befriend classmates and gradually extract their most intimate secrets, not through manipulation or coercion, but through an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed her to unlock minds like safes. She collected these secrets like trophies, storing them in detailed journals that she kept hidden in her bedroom. At 16, Margaret conducted her first experiment in what she would later call consciousness transfer. She had befriended an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who was suffering from early-stage dementia. Margaret spent hours listening to the woman's stories about her youth, her marriage, her children, absorbing every detail with photographic precision. When Mrs. Patterson's condition worsened and she was hospitalized, Margaret volunteered to sit with her during her final days. As the old woman lay dying, Margaret held her hand and whispered that she would preserve her memories, that her experiences would live on through someone who truly understood their value. Mrs. Patterson died peacefully, but Margaret felt something profound had occurred during those final moments. She was convinced that she had somehow absorbed the woman's essence, that her memories and experiences had transferred to Margaret's consciousness. She began experiencing vivid dreams about events from Mrs. Patterson's life, memories that felt as real and immediate as her own. Whether this was genuine psychic phenomenon or elaborate self-delusion, Margaret became obsessed with the idea that consciousness could be transferred from one person to another. She threw herself into studying neuroscience, psychology, and psychiatry, always searching for scientific validation of her belief that human memories and experiences could be harvested and preserved. By the time Margaret completed her psychiatric residency at Johns Hopkins, she had developed sophisticated theories about what she called experiential archaeology, the idea that traumatic experiences left permanent imprints on the brain that could be accessed and extracted through proper techniques. Her professors were impressed by her innovative approaches to treating severe mental illness, never suspecting that her insights came from her belief that she could literally steal her patients' experiences. In 1978, Margaret accepted a position at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital, a state facility that housed the most severely disturbed patients in Oregon. The hospital's isolation and the nature of its patient population made it perfect for Margaret's purposes. These were people whose disappearances would be attributed to suicide or natural causes, whose families had often abandoned them, whose stories would die with them unless someone preserved them. Margaret's first victim at Riverside was Thomas Brennan, a Vietnam veteran suffering from severe PTSD who had been institutionalized after a violent breakdown. Thomas was haunted by memories of combat, experiences so vivid and traumatic that they had shattered his ability to function in normal society. Margaret saw him as a treasure trove of experiences she had never lived, memories of war and violence that would expand her understanding of human consciousness. Margaret spent months gaining Thomas's trust, positioning herself as the only person who truly understood his suffering. She used advanced therapeutic techniques to help him access his most buried memories, encouraging him to relive his traumatic experiences in vivid detail. But instead of helping him process and heal from these memories, Margaret was studying them, cataloging them, preparing to make them her own. "Thomas, I want you to tell me about the night your unit was ambushed," she would say during their sessions. "Don't just remember it, live it again. I need to understand exactly what you saw, what you felt, what you thought in those moments. Every detail is important." Thomas, desperate for someone who seemed to understand his pain, would relive his worst memories with Margaret's encouragement. He described the smell of burning flesh, the sound of incoming mortars, the weight of his dying friend in his arms. Margaret recorded everything, not for therapeutic purposes, but as preparation for what she called memory integration. The murder took place in Margaret's private office during what Thomas believed was a breakthrough therapy session. Margaret had prepared a special injection that she claimed would help him process his traumatic memories more effectively. In reality, the injection contained a paralytic agent that would render him conscious but unable to move or speak. As Thomas lay helpless, Margaret explained what was about to happen with the calm, professional tone she used in medical conferences. "Thomas, you're going to help me preserve your experiences in a way that ensures they'll never be lost. Your memories of war, your understanding of violence and survival will become part of something larger than yourself." Margaret's method was based on her belief that memories could be transferred through direct neural contact during the dying process. She placed electrodes on Thomas's skull and her own, convinced that the electrical activity of his dying brain would somehow transmit his experiences to her consciousness. As she slowly administered a lethal injection, she monitored both their brainwaves, searching for evidence of memory transfer. Thomas's death took several hours, during which Margaret maintained constant physical contact with him, believing that proximity would enhance the transfer process. She spoke continuously about his memories, repeating his stories back to him, convinced that this would help integrate his experiences into her own consciousness. When Thomas finally died, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. She was convinced that she had successfully absorbed his memories, that his experiences of war and trauma had become part of her own consciousness. She began experiencing vivid dreams about Vietnam, memories that felt as real as her own experiences, confirming her belief that the transfer had been successful. Thomas's death was attributed to complications from his psychiatric medications, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in a facility treating severely disturbed patients. Margaret, as his primary physician, was praised for her dedication to his care and her professional handling of his death. But Thomas was just the beginning. Margaret had proven to herself that consciousness transfer was possible, and she began systematically selecting patients whose experiences would expand her understanding of human existence. She targeted those with the most extreme and unusual life experiences: combat veterans, abuse survivors, criminals, artists, anyone whose memories would add new dimensions to her consciousness. Each murder was carefully planned and executed. Margaret would spend months studying her chosen victim, learning their history, understanding their psychological makeup, preparing for the integration of their experiences. She developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for what she believed was memory extraction, using combinations of drugs, electrical stimulation, and psychological manipulation. Sarah Mitchell was a young woman who had survived a horrific childhood of sexual abuse and had developed multiple personality disorder as a coping mechanism. Margaret was fascinated by Sarah's fractured consciousness, believing that her multiple personalities represented different sets of experiences that could be harvested separately. Margaret's approach with Sarah was particularly elaborate. She spent over a year working with each of Sarah's personalities, gaining their trust, learning their individual memories and experiences. She was convinced that Sarah's mind contained multiple lifetimes' worth of experiences compressed into a single consciousness. The murder took place during what Sarah believed was a revolutionary new treatment that would help integrate her personalities. Margaret had convinced her that the procedure would heal her fractured mind, allowing her to become whole for the first time in her life. Instead, Margaret was planning to harvest the experiences of each personality before killing the host consciousness. Margaret's technique involved inducing a state where all of Sarah's personalities were simultaneously conscious, then systematically interviewing each one while monitoring brain activity. She believed that this would allow her to map the neural pathways associated with each set of memories, making the transfer process more efficient. Sarah's death was the most complex Margaret had ever attempted. She spent over 12 hours in contact with the dying woman, convinced that she was absorbing decades of experiences from multiple personalities. When Sarah finally died, Margaret felt that she had gained not just one person's memories, but the experiences of several distinct consciousnesses. Margaret's collection of stolen memories grew with each murder. She began experiencing an increasingly complex inner life, filled with memories and experiences that spanned multiple lifetimes. She could recall fighting in Vietnam through Thomas's memories, surviving childhood abuse through Sarah's experiences, and dozens of other lives through the consciousness she had harvested from her victims. But Margaret's appetite for experiences was growing beyond what individual murders could provide. She began planning what she called collective harvesting, the simultaneous murder of multiple patients whose combined experiences would create what she believed would be a super consciousness containing the accumulated wisdom of many lives. Margaret's most ambitious project involved 7 patients with radically different backgrounds: a former priest who had lost his faith, a concert pianist who had gone insane, a serial killer who claimed to hear voices, a mother who had murdered her children, an artist who painted with his own blood, a mathematician who believed he had solved the universe's equations, and a child prodigy who had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Margaret spent 2 years preparing for what she called the Great Integration, studying each patient's experiences, mapping their psychological profiles, planning the complex procedure that would allow her to harvest all their memories simultaneously. She was convinced that the combined consciousness of these 7 individuals would transform her into something beyond human, a being with access to the full spectrum of human experience. The murders took place in a specially prepared chamber in the hospital's basement, a room Margaret had equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment and restraint systems. She arranged the 7 patients in a circle, with herself at the center, connected to each of them through a network of electrodes and IV lines. Margaret's plan was to keep all 7 patients conscious during the dying process, allowing their experiences to flow into her consciousness as their brains shut down. She administered carefully calibrated doses of various drugs, maintaining their awareness while slowly killing them, convinced that she was conducting the most important experiment in human history. The procedure lasted over 18 hours, during which Margaret believed she was absorbing the accumulated experiences of 7 lifetimes. She felt their memories flooding into her consciousness: the priest's crisis of faith, the pianist's musical genius, the killer's homicidal urges, the mother's maternal love and guilt, the artist's creative madness, the mathematician's cosmic insights, and the child's innocent brilliance. When the last patient died, Margaret was convinced that she had achieved something unprecedented in human history. She believed she had become a repository for human experience, a living library of consciousness that contained the essence of multiple lives. She felt that she had transcended normal human limitations and achieved a form of immortality through the preservation of stolen memories. But Margaret's crimes were discovered when a night janitor found the chamber containing the 7 bodies. The sophisticated equipment, the restraint systems, and Margaret's detailed notes about consciousness transfer revealed the full scope of her activities. When police searched her office and home, they found thousands of pages documenting her belief in memory harvesting and her detailed plans for future experiments. Margaret showed no remorse when confronted with the evidence of her crimes. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' horror at her work, insisting that she had preserved the experiences and memories of people who would otherwise have been forgotten. She offered to share her accumulated consciousness with researchers, believing that her stolen memories represented invaluable scientific data. I have preserved the experiences of 27 human beings, she told investigators. Their memories, their knowledge, their understanding of life, all of it lives on through me. I have created a form of immortality that ensures their experiences will never be lost. How can that be considered murder when I've actually preserved their essence? During her trial, Margaret attempted to demonstrate her absorbed memories by recounting detailed experiences from her victims' lives. She could describe Thomas's combat experiences with the accuracy of someone who had lived through them, could play piano pieces that Sarah's musical personality had known, could solve mathematical equations that the mathematician patient had worked on. Whether these demonstrations represented genuine memory transfer or elaborate psychological delusion, the jury was horrified by Margaret's complete lack of remorse and her continued insistence that her victims should be grateful for their preservation. They convicted her on all counts, and she was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in prison, Margaret continued to believe that she carried the consciousness of her victims within her mind. She spent her time writing detailed accounts of their experiences, claiming that she was preserving their memories for future generations. She maintained that her crimes had been acts of preservation rather than destruction, that she had saved her victims from the ultimate death of being forgotten. Dr. Margaret Holloway died in prison in 2009, still convinced that she had achieved a form of immortality through the theft of human consciousness. Her writings were destroyed by court order, but the case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how scientific delusion can justify the most heinous crimes. The case revealed the terrifying potential for medical authority to mask the most profound evil. Margaret had used her position as a healer to gain access to the most vulnerable patients, her psychiatric expertise to manipulate their trust, and her scientific training to justify murder as research. Today, Riverside Psychiatric Hospital has implemented strict protocols for patient safety and research oversight. But Margaret's legacy lingers in the medical community's awareness that the power to heal can be perverted into the power to destroy. She proved that the most dangerous predators are sometimes those who claim to preserve life while systematically destroying it. In the end, Margaret Holloway killed not for pleasure or power, but for the godlike satisfaction of believing she could steal the essence of human experience and make it her own. She was a thief who stole not possessions or money, but memories, consciousness, the very core of what made her victims human. Her story serves as a reminder that evil can wear the white coat of healing, that the most sophisticated minds can harbor the most primitive impulses, and that sometimes the greatest monsters are those who claim to be preserving the very thing they are destroying.